A careful analysis of the teacher-student relationship at any level, inside or outside the school, reveals its fundamentally narrative character. This relationship involves a narrating subject, the teacher, and patient, listening objects, the students. The contents, whether values of empirical dimensions of reality, tend in the process of being narrated to become lifeless and petrified. Education is suffering from narration sickness. The teacher talks about reality as if it were motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable, or else he expounds on a topic completely alien to the existential experience of the students. His task is to fill the students with the contents of his narration, contents which are detached from reality, disconnected from the totality that engendered them and could give them significance. Words are emptied of their concreteness and become a hollow, alienated, and alienating verbosity. The outstanding characteristic of this narrative education, then, is the sonority of words, not their transforming power. 4 times 4 is 16, the capital of para is Belem. The student records, memorizes, and repeats these phrases without perceiving what 4 times 4 really means, or realizing the true significance of capital in the affirmation, the capital of Para is Belem. That is, what Belem means for Para, and what Para means for Brazil. Narration, with the teacher as narrator, leads the students to memorize mechanically the narrated content. Worse yet, it turns them into containers, into receptacles, to be filled by the teacher. The more completely he fills the receptacles, the better a teacher he is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better the students they are. Education thus becomes an act of depositing, in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. Instead of communicating, the teacher uses communiques, and makes deposits which the students patiently receive, memorize, and repeat. This is the banking concept of education, in which the scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filing, and storing the deposits. They do, it is true, have the opportunity to become collectors or catalogers of the things they store, but in the last analysis, it is men themselves who are filed away through the lack of creativity, transformation, and knowledge in this, at best, misguided system. For apart from inquiry, apart from the praxis, men cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention. Through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry men pursue in the world, and with each other. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those who they consider to know nothing. Projecting an absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as processes of inquiry. The teacher presents himself to the students as their necessary opposite. By considering their ignorance absolute, he justifies his own existence. The students, alienated like the slave in the Hegelian dialectic, accept their ignorance as justifying the teacher's existence. But, unlike the slave, they never discover that they educate the teacher. The raison d'etre of liberation education, on the other hand, lies in its drive towards reconciliation. Education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction, by reconciling the poles of the contradictions so that both are simultaneously teachers and students. This solution is not, nor can it be, found in the banking concept. On the contrary, banking education maintains and even stimulates the contradiction through the following attitudes and practices, which mirror oppressive society as a whole. The teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and the students listen, meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses and enforces his choice, and the students comply. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. The teacher chooses the program content, and the students, who are not consulted, adapt to it. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his own professional authority, which he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. The teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. It is not surprising that the banking concept of education regards men as adaptable, manageable beings. The more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of that world. The more completely they accept the passive role imposed on them, the more they tend simply to adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. The capability of banking education to minimize or annul the students' creative power and to stimulate their credulity serves the interests of the oppressors, who are neither to have the world revealed nor to see it transformed. The oppressors use their humanitarianism to preserve a profitable situation. Thus, they react almost instinctively against any experiment in education which stimulates the creative faculties and is not content with a partial view of reality, but always seeks out the ties which link one point to another and one problem to another. Indeed, the interests of the oppressors lie in changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. For the more oppressed the more the oppressed can be led to adapt to the situation, the more easily they can be dominated. To achieve this end, the oppressors use the banking concept of education in conjunction with a paternalistic social action apparatus, within which the oppressed receive the euphemistic title of welfare recipients. They are treated as individual cases and marginalized men who deviate from the general configuration of good, organized, and just society. The oppressed are regarded as a pathology of a healthy society, which must therefore adjust these incompetent and lazy folk to its own patterns by changing their mentality. These marginals need to be integrated, incorporated into the healthy society that they have forsaken. The truth is, however, that the oppressed are not marginals, are not men living outside society. They've always been inside the structure which made them beings for others. The solution is not to integrate them into the structure of oppression, but to transform that structure so that they can become beings for themselves. Such transformation, of course, would undermine the oppressor's purposes. Hence, their utilization of the banking concept of education, to avoid the threat of student conscientization. The banking approach to adult education, for example, will never propose to students that they critically consider reality. It will deal instead with such vital questions as whether Roger gave green grass to the goat, and insist upon the importance of learning that, on the contrary, Roger gave green grass to the rabbit. The humanism of the banking approach masks the effort to turn men into automatons, the very negation of their ontological vocation to be more fully human. Those who use the banking approach knowingly or unknowingly, for there are innumerable well-intentioned bank clerk teachers who do not realize that they are serving only to dehumanize. What they fail to perceive that the deposits themselves contain contradictions about reality. But sooner or later, these contradictions may lead formerly passive students to turn against their domestication and the attempt to domesticate reality. They may discover, through existential experience, that their present way of life is irreconcilable with their vocation to become more fully human. They may perceive through their relations with reality that reality is really a process undergoing constant transformation. If men are searchers and their ontological vocation is humanization, sooner or later they may perceive the contradiction in which banking education seeks to maintain them, and then engage themselves in the struggle for their liberation. But the humanist revolutionary educator cannot wait for this possibility to materialize. From the outset, his efforts must coincide with those of the students to engage in critical thinking and the quest for mutual humanization. His efforts must be imbued with a profound trust in men and their creative power. To achieve this, he must be a partner of the students in his relations with them. The banking concept does not admit to such partnership, and necessarily so. To resolve the teacher-student contradiction, to exchange the role of depositor, prescriber, domesticator for the role of student among students would be to undermine the power of oppression and serve the cause of liberation. Implicit in the banking concept is the assumption of a dichotomy between man and the world. Man is merely in the world, not with the world or with others. Man is spectator, not recreator. In this view, man is not a conscious being, corpo consciente. He is rather the possessor of a consciousness, an empty mind, passively open to the reception of deposits of reality from the world outside. For example, my desk, my books, my coffee cup, all the objects before me, as bits of the world which surround me, would be inside me, exactly as I am inside my study right now. This view makes no distinction between being accessible to consciousness and entering consciousness. The distinction, however, is essential. The objects which surround me are simply accessible to my consciousness, not located within it. I am aware of them, but they are not inside me. It follows logically from the banking notion of consciousness that the educator's role is to regulate the way the world enters into the students. His task is to organize a process which already occurs spontaneously, to fill the students by making deposits of information which he considers to constitute true knowledge. And since men receive the world as passive entities, education should make them more passive still, and adapt them to the world. The educated man is the adapted man because he is better fit for the world. Translated into practice, this concept is well suited to the purposes of the oppressors, whose tranquility rests on how well men fit the world the oppressors have created, and how little they question it. The more completely the majority adapt to the purposes which the dominant minority prescribe for them, thereby depriving them of the right to their own purposes, the more easily the minority can continue to prescribe. The theory and practice of banking education serves this end quite efficiently. Verbalistic lessons, reading requirements, the methods for evaluating knowledge, the distance between the teacher and the taught, the criteria for promotion, everything in this ready-to-wear approach serves to obviate thinking. The bank clerk educator does not realize that there is no true security in his hypertrophied role, that one must seek to live with others in solidarity. One cannot impose oneself, nor even merely coexist with one's students. Solidarity requires true communication, and the concept by which such an educator is guided fears and prescribes communication. Yet only through communication can human life hold meaning. The teacher's thinking is authenticated only by the authenticity of the student's thinking. The teacher cannot think for his students, nor can he impose thought on them. Authentic thinking that is concerned about reality, does not take place in ivory tower isolation, but only in communication. If it is true that thought has meaning only when generated by action upon the world, the subordination of students to teachers becomes impossible. Because banking education begins with a false understanding of men as objects, it cannot promote the development of what Fromm calls biophily, but instead produces its opposite, necrophily. While life is characterized by growth in a structured, functional manner, the necrophilous person loves all that does not grow, all that is mechanical. The necrophilous person is driven by the desire to transform the organic into the inorganic, to approach life mechanically, as if all living persons were things. Memory, rather than experience, having rather than being, is what counts. The necrophilous person can relate to an object, a flower, or a person, only if he possesses it. Hence, a threat to his possession is a threat to himself. If he loses possession, he loses contact with the world. He loves control, and in the act of controlling, he kills life. Oppression, overwhelming control, is necrophilic. It is nourished by love of death, not life. The banking concept of education, which serves the interests of oppression, is also necrophilic. Based on a mechanistic, static, naturalistic, spatialized view of consciousness, it transforms students into receiving objects. It attempts to control thinking and action, leads men to adjust to the world, and inhibits their creative power. When their efforts to act responsibly are frustrated, when they find themselves unable to use their faculties, men suffer. This suffering due to impotence is rooted in the very fact that the human equilibrium has been disturbed. But the inability to act which causes men's anguish also causes them to reject their impotence by attempting to restore their capacity to act. But can they, and how? One way is to submit to and identify with a person or group having power. By this symbolic participation in another person's life, men have the illusion of acting, when in reality they only submit to and become a part of those who act. Populist manifestations perhaps best exemplify this type of behavior by the oppressed who, by identifying with charismatic leaders, come to feel that they themselves are active and effective. The rebellion they express as they emerge in the historical process is motivated by the desire to act effectively. The dominant elites consider the remedy to be more domination and repression carried out in the name of freedom, order, and social peace. That is, the peace of the elites. Thus, they can condemn logically, from their point of view at least, the violence of a strike by workers, and can call upon the strike in the same breath to use violence in putting down the strike. Education as the exercise of domination stimulates the credulity of students, with the ideological intent, often not perceived by educators, of indoctrinating them to adapt to the world of oppression. This accusation is not made in the naive hope that the dominant elites will thereby simply abandon the practice. Its objective is to call to the attention of true humanists the fact that they cannot use banking educational methods in the pursuit of liberation, for they would only negate that very pursuit. Nor may a revolutionary society inherit these methods from an oppressor society. The revolutionary society which practices banking education is either misguided or mistrusting of men. In either event, it is threatened by the specter of reaction. Unfortunately, those who espouse the cause of liberation are themselves surrounded and influenced by the climate which generates the banking concept, and often do not perceive its true significance or its dehumanizing power. Paradoxically, then, they utilize this same instrument of alienation in what they consider an effort to liberate. Indeed, some revolutionaries brand as innocents, dreamers, or even reactionaries those who would challenge this educational practice. But one does not liberate men by alienating them. Authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made in men. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men upon their world in order to transform it. Those truly committed to the cause of liberation can accept neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor the use of banking methods of domination, propaganda, slogans, deposits, in the name of liberation. Those truly committed to liberation must reject the banking concept in its entirety, adopting instead a concept of men as conscious beings, and consciousness as consciousness intent upon the world. They must abandon the educational goal of deposit making and replace it with the posing of the problems of men in their relations with the world. Problem-posing education, responding to the essence of consciousness, intentionality, rejects communiques and embodies communication. It epitomizes the special characteristic of consciousness, being conscious of, not only as intent on objects, but as turned in upon itself, in a Jasperian split, consciousness as consciousness of consciousness. Liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transferals of information. It is a learning situation in which the cognizable object, far from being the end of the cognitive act, intermediates the cognitive actors, teacher on the one hand and students on the other. Accordingly, the practice of problem-posing education entails at the outset that the teacher-student contradiction be resolved. Dialogical relations indispensable to the capacity of cognitive actors to cooperate in perceiving the same cognizable object are otherwise impossible. Indeed, problem-posing education, which breaks with the vertical patterns characteristic of banking education, can fulfill its function as the practice of freedom only if it can overcome the above contradiction. Through dialogue, the teacher of the students and the students of the teacher cease to exist, and a new term emerges, teacher-student, with students-teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. In this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. Here, no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught. Men teach each other, mediated by the world, by the cognizable objects which in banking education are owned by the teacher. The banking concept, with its tendency to dichotomize everything, distinguishes two stages in the action of the educator. During the first, he cognizes a cognizable object, while he prepares his lesson in his study or his laboratory. During the second, he expounds to his students about that object. The students are not called upon to know, but to memorize the contents narrated by the teacher. Nor do the students practice any act of cognition, since the object toward which that act should be directed is the property of the teacher rather than a medium invoking the critical reflection of both teacher and students. Hence, in the name of the preservation of culture and knowledge, we have a system which achieves neither true knowledge nor true culture. The problem-posing method does not dichotomize the activity of the teacher-student. He is not cognitive at one point and narrative at another. He is always cognitive, whether preparing a project or engaging in dialogue with students. He does not regard cognizable objects as his private property, but as the object of reflection by himself and the students. In this way, the problem-posing educator constantly reforms his reflections and the reflections of the students. The students, no longer docile listeners, are now critical co-investigators in dialogue with the teacher. The teacher presents the material to the students for their consideration and reconsiders his earlier considerations as the students express their own. The role of the problem-posing educator is to create together with the students the conditions under which knowledge at the level of doxa is superseded by true knowledge at the level of logos. Whereas banking education anesthetizes and inhibits creative power, problem-posing education involves a constant unveiling of reality. The former attempts to maintain and the submersion of consciousness. The latter strives for the emergence of consciousness and critical intervention in reality. Students, as they are increasingly posed with problems relating to themselves and the world and with the world, will feel increasingly challenged and obliged to respond to that challenge. Because they apprehend the challenge as interrelated to other problems within a total context, as not as a theoretical question, the resulting comprehension tends to be increasingly critical and thus constantly less alienated. Their response to the challenge evokes new challenges, followed by new understandings, and gradually the students come to regard themselves as committed. Education as the practice of freedom, as opposed to education as the practice of domination, denies that man is abstract, isolated, independent, and unattached to the world. It also denies that the world exists as a reality apart from men. Authentic reflection considers neither abstract man nor the world without men, but men in their relations with the world. In these relations, consciousness and world are simultaneous. Consciousness neither precedes the world nor follows it. La conscience et le monde sont dormés dans le coup. Extérieur par essence à la conscience, le monde est par essence relatif à elle. In one of our culture circles in Chile, the group was discussing, based on a codification, the anthropological concept of culture. In the midst of the discussion, a peasant, who by banking standards was completely ignorant, said, "Now I see that without man there is no world." When the educator responded, "Let's say for the sake of argument that all the men on earth were to die, but that the earth itself remained, together with trees and birds and animals, rivers, seas, and stars. Wouldn't all this be a world?" "Oh no," the peasant replied emphatically. "There would be no one to say this is a world." The peasant wished to express the idea that there would be lacking the consciousness of the world, which necessarily implies the world of consciousness. I cannot exist without a not I. In turn, the not I depends on that existence. The world which brings consciousness into existence becomes the world of that consciousness. Hence the previously cited affirmation of Sartre, La conscience et le monde sont endormis dans le même cul. As men, simultaneously reflecting on themselves and on the world, increase the scope of their perception, they begin to direct their observations toward previously inconspicuous phenomena. In perception, properly so called, an explicit awareness, I am turned toward the object, to the paper for instance. I apprehend it as being this here and now. This apprehension is a singling out, every object having a background in the experience. Around and about the paper lie books, pencils, inkwell, and so forth, and these, in a certain sense, are also perceived, perceptually there in the field of intuition. But whilst I was turned towards the paper, there was no turning in the direction, nor any apprehending of them, not even in a secondary sense. They appeared, and yet were not singled out, were not posited on their own account. Every perception of a thing has such a zone of background intuitions, or background awareness, if intuiting already includes the state of being turned towards, and this also is a conscious experience, or more briefly, a consciousness of all indeed that in point of fact lies in the co-perceived objective background. That which had existed objectively, but had not been perceived in its deeper implications, if indeed was perceived at all, begins to stand out. Assuming the character of a problem and therefore the challenge, thus men begin to single out elements of their background awareness and to reflect upon them. These elements are now objects of men's consideration, and as such, objects of their action and cognition. In problem-posing education, men develop their power to perceive critically the way they exist in the world, with which and in which they find themselves. They come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality in process and transformation. Although the dialectical relations of men with the world exist independently of how these relations are perceived, or whether or not they are perceived at all, it is also true that the form of action men adopt is to a large extent a function of how they perceive themselves in the world. Hence, the teacher's student and the student's teachers reflect simultaneously on themselves and the world without dichotomizing this reflection from action, and thus establish an authentic form of thought and action. Once again, the two educational concepts and practices under analysis come into conflict. Banking education, for obvious reasons, attempts by mythicizing reality to conceal certain facts which explain the way men exist in the world. Problem-posing education sets itself the task of demythologizing. Banking education resists dialogue. Problem-posing education regards dialogue as indispensable to the act of cognition which unveils reality. Banking education treats students as objects of assistance. Problem-posing education makes them critical thinkers. Banking education inhibits creative and domesticates. Banking education inhibits creativity and domesticates, although it cannot completely destroy the intentionality of consciousness by isolating consciousness from the world, thereby denying men their ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Problem-posing education bases itself on creativity and stimulates the true reflection and action upon reality, thereby responding to the vocation of men as beings, who are authentic only when engaged in inquiry and creative transformation. In sum, banking theory and practice, as immobilizing and fixating forces, fail to acknowledge men as historical beings. Problem-posing theory and practice takes man's historicity as their starting point. Problem-posing education affirms men as beings in the process of becoming, as unfinished, uncompleted beings in and with a likewise unfinished reality. Indeed, in contrast to other animals who are unfinished, but not historical, men know themselves to be unfinished. But they are aware of their incompletion. In this incompletion and this awareness lie the very roots of education as an exclusively human manifestation. The unfinished character of men and the transformational character of reality necessitate that education be an ongoing activity. Education is thus constantly remade in the praxis. In order to be, it must become. Its duration, in the Bergsonian meaning of the word, is found in the interplay of the opposites, permanence and change. The banking method emphasizes permanence and becomes reactionary. Problem-posing education, which accepts neither a well-behaved present nor a predetermined future, roots itself in the dynamic present and becomes a revolutionary, problem-posing education. Problem-posing education is revolutionary futurity. Hence it is prophetic, and as such hopeful. Hence it corresponds to the historical nature of man. Hence it affirms men as beings who transcend themselves, who move forward and look ahead, for whom immobility represents a fatal threat, for whom looking at the past must only be a means of understanding more clearly what and who they are, so that they can more wisely build the future. Hence it identifies with the movement which engages men as beings aware of their incompletion, an historical movement which has in its point of departure its subjects and its objective. The point of departure of the movement lies in men themselves. Since men do not exist apart from the world, apart from reality, the movement must begin with the men-world relationship. Accordingly, the point of departure must always be with men in the here and now, which constitutes the situation within which they are submerged, from which they emerge, and in which they intervene. Only by starting from the situation which determines their perception of it can they begin to move. To do this authentically, they must perceive their state not as fated and unalterable, but merely as limiting and therefore challenging. Whereas the banking method directly or indirectly reinforces men's fatalistic perception of their situation, the problem-posing method presents this very situation to them as a problem. As the situation becomes the object of their cognition, the naive or magical perception which produced their fatalism gives way to perception which is able to perceive itself even as it perceives reality, and can thus be critically objective about that reality. A deepened consciousness of their situation leads men to apprehend that situation as an historical reality